Let's talk about leadership disruptors. And the number one we are all facing right now is AI. Yes, it can ask you powerful questions, but it can't call BS when you're lying to yourself. And while AI can ask these powerful questions, it can't synchronize this nervous system to reground us when we're at our most stressed. And while it can validate our feelings, it can't call our bluff when we need it the most. I'm Kim Bohr, President and COO of SparkEffect and host of the Courage to Advance podcast. And on this episode, we're diving into why the most transformative leadership breakthroughs happen not through these algorithms, but through this irreplaceable power of human connection, this productive tension, and biological synchronization. So today's guest, I am so excited for. I can't think of a better person to have discussed this with than Rod Bacon, our Chief Coaching Officer at SparkEffect. Rod has held several executive roles prior to SparkEffect that have really informed the work he does as an executive coach with C-level leaders. And his philosophy really crystallizes so much of this discussion today around this principle he holds that personal growth is professional growth. Rod, welcome to Courage to Advance podcast.
Thank you. Happy to be here.
So, Rod, everyone's asking, will AI replace executive coaches? But is that the wrong question? Is the real question, as AI takes over more of our analytical and tactical work, how do we evolve the kind of transformative leaders in our organizations that we will desperately need?
I like the framing of that question, and a couple things come up. First, I want to say the first part of your question, will AI eliminate executive coaches? I kind of want to say, yeah, to the ones who aren't really bringing those core human skills, where the executive coaches think everything is about asking the right question, that's going to fall away because chat bots and AI bots can do that. So we'll explore, I think, what some of those deeper human capabilities are that are really critical for creating transformative change. And then the other part about your question about the need for transformative thinking is exactly what I see is going to be coming down the road. Because the way I think about it, and I'm totally embracing it, and we at SparkEffect are embracing it, is like outsourcing that analytical thinking capability. So we're going to get better at that. Everybody's going to get better at that, have the tools. The key thing that we need to get better at then is managing, regulating our emotions, creating deeper trust, and connecting with people.
Mm-hmm.
And so, a good place to start on that actually maybe is in this area of kind of that regulation. When executive coaches, at least the ones that we develop and work
Mm-hmm.
with Spark Effect, when they're working with executives, it's as much about who they are and how they are creating a resonance and a presence with whoever they're working with. It's more about that than it is about just asking powerful questions.
I think one of the real important differentiators that we've been pulling forward as we've been rethinking this executive coaching with this AI is that biological synchronization, where we literally, when we're in conversations, there's nuance
Hmm.
through body language or there's nuance through subtleties that we help bring forward that
Hmm.
we don't see AI able to do that in the same degree, right? And like you start off by saying there's so much of the tactical task-based stuff that is absolutely valuable, but not this next level just isn't there. And
Right.
our belief is that it probably won't be there. So, Rod, walk us through what's actually happening in the brain when a coaching kind of moment breaks through that makes this biological synchronization so important to our perspective in the way that we're talking about it.
Yeah, perfect. Because the essence of executive coaching, especially if we're working with that transformative change, is creating that ability for the human to actually do change. So, under stress, what's happening is our amygdala is keeping us away from that kind of safety to be able to explore new opportunities. And it's those mirror neurons that connect between us that create our resonance together. So the way I think about it is when we meet with an executive, especially if they're under stress, what's happening is that we have to, if we are calm, if our nervous systems are regulated, it creates a space for the other executive to slow down and synchronize and create a resonance. The threat center, that amygdala, the threat center starts
Mhm.
to soften. And then we can have, or they can have access to that prefrontal cortex piece where you're able to look at yourself and think about what's happening. But if you think about it, when we're under stress, we don't have access to that synchronization. So that's why the element, the essence of the coach has to be self-aware. They have to monitor their body, come into the relationship, hold that center, allow that regulation between the two systems to start to happen. And then you can start to access those, that again, that prefrontal cortex and explore what you might do differently,
Mhm.
access creativity and insight. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. Do you have an example to share where that's been brought forward? And are there some tools you might say these were some of the ways that you came to that place with this executive you were coaching?
When I thought about just our conversation overall, there's lots of examples, but I think sometimes it's these simple ones that hit home. Again, don't overcomplicate them. So I remember I was working with an executive at a biotech firm, and she was an always on type A personality. It was a Zoom-based meeting because other people will sometimes talk about, can we do this
Yeah.
synchronization over Zoom? And she was just going off again on the polished answers about what she was doing. Because when she came to coaching, she typically came in, I don't know if it was a fear or a performance piece, but she was, again, an always on person.
Hmm.
But this particular time, I remember she was just talking about all the different things were happening. And I took a risk. That's something that executive coaches, I think, have to do is kind of stretch beyond what feels comfortable sometimes.
Hmm.
And I don't always do this, but with her, I just asked her, I said, hey, I feel like we're going really fast. Can we just slow down? Can we actually just like pause for 30 seconds and just breathe? And it was a bit, like I said, it was a bit of a stretch. And I could see her shift a little bit, like, okay, I guess. And then we just paused. Longer than that, we just hung out for a minute. And what happened is that a shift seemed to happen. I can tell that she visibly changed a little bit.
Hmm.
And she said, wow, that's what I needed. And because she was able to slow down and start to connect. And from there, I would say to her, I hear a lot is going on and what's really going on underneath the surface. But it was that simple as it is, that stopping
Hmm.
and connecting, which brought attention to that resonance I was talking about. And from there, the relationship was able to change, and she broke open about how much stress she was under, and stuff she was having to do.
Yeah. I love that example because it really shows this was another item on her agenda for the day,
Yeah.
right? And she was just in that motion of checking the boxes and not really showing up to to do the work because she was just moving through the list of whatever was going on. And that sounds heavy too to hear you describe how she came in. I feel a weight in imagining what that was like. And I can also feel what you described as the reset of, oh, I could feel their energy shift just by how you even paused in what you were sharing with us.
Yeah, it's really amazing to me, Kim, how important, and I want to say again how simple, because if we think about the biological nature of this, the idea of the mirror neurons. Oh, by the way, I don't know if you know of a therapist called Resma McKenna. He wrote a book called My Grandmother's Hands. It's all about the somatic nature of doing therapeutic work. And I love what he said. He said, clients don't realize it, but when they come to me, what they're coming to me for is to regulate their nervous system.
That's
And
important.
yeah, and the same concept we said before is if your mind is in that busy mode, if you're under a lot of stress, that fight, flight, and freeze mechanism is keeping us from that prefrontal cortex, that amazing thing that evolved in evolution that allows us to have that reflective nature and that creative thinking. So what Resma says is that the responsibility of the therapist to work with, to breathe, and to be that deep rudder so that the other can synchronize with them so that they can do the work. And as you were speaking, another, I don't want to go into too many stories, but another one came up to me where a very high powered executive, and she came into tears. I think sometimes it's just that nature of really feeling like you're seen. I love AI and we're using the heck out of it, but it's this kind of thing where AI can't slow down. And AI can ask the powerful question. AI can't synchronize a nervous system.
Right. And that's so important for all of us. And it's what you described in that work is really powerful to think about how, in some ways, it's very simple too. The techniques can be very simple to just have that moment. And we talk about having those pauses. And I think we use that terminology so lightly and
Right.
not understanding actually the power of it. You alluded to this around the synchronization when we're talking about Zoom. And how do you coach people or leaders specifically when they're thinking about, hey, their teams and we're always on Zoom and we're moving through meetings after meetings, and what is happening there when there's a need to say, hey, I think something's off? Or how do you try to have teams regulate or in those kind of settings where it's not just one-on-one?
Exactly. I think a lot of times people think in this virtual world of using Zoom, again, it's all around organizing the content or presenting in certain ways. But even over Zoom, my belief is that the other humans on your team are looking for and needing that sense of human connection.
Mm-hmm.
And what's fascinating, because when Zoom first came out, all of our stuff in this world of COVID, I was on that side of really being curious, looking at all the different fields, like in therapy, et cetera. It's like, can they create the same kind of results in a virtual, in a remote setting? And the answer is yes, because it's about the pacing.
Mm-hmm.
It's about having people feel seen. And so sometimes with Zoom, we want to forget that and we go to content, but it can happen just the same. So
Yeah.
there's lots of ways, but it really very powerful, very doable, and it's very important to slow down and do some of the same techniques that you do in a face-to-face for creating that synchronization over a Zoom setting.
So that takes us into this other pillar, if you will. We talk about at SparkEffect, where we have a really strong belief that tension is really required for transformation to happen. And I
Hmm.
know that may sound very controversial to some of the listeners, but that is really, if any of us sit and think, we often realize our biggest growth comes from the challenges we face. And
Exactly.
so I think it's really important that we talk about why is this discomfort so necessary for growth? And thinking about that from the executive coaching perspective, I'd love to have you share your thoughts.
Yeah, yeah. Well, something we talk about amongst our coaches sometimes is this thing of sacred pressure. Coaching is not just warm empathy, but it's creating that place of tension, right? That where the
Hmm.
growth can happen. I mean, for all learning, like even when you look at a child learning to tie their shoes, there's vulnerability and there's failure. But
Hmm.
as we get older, our identity sometimes forms so much around, I'm not going to be vulnerable. Failure is not an option. It doesn't look good on me. And we create this kind of layered shell of this performative nature of being. And so, by gosh, it's the coaches in the world that are hired that they have to do their own work to
Hmm.
stretch, to be able to call BS when they see it and create that tension. It's not always easy. I think it takes training and a certain amount of courage because coaches also are human. So
Hmm.
they want to perform right, they want to get to the right outcomes. And sometimes by creating this tension, you're not exactly sure which way it's going to go,
Yeah.
but it's critical. Again, the AI can offer insights, but they can't call a bluff.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember a situation not long ago where one of the key things we run into in coaching a lot is people talking about cascading accountability down through their organization. I was working with one of our clients just recently, and that's what he was saying. He's a CEO of
Hmm.
a hospital, and he was talking about accountability through his team and why they're not doing this and et cetera, et cetera. And in this particular case, my calling BS a little bit is when I asked him and said, so are you modeling the same kind of accountability? And he started to talk, yes. And I just paused. And that one I just gave him because I talked to him enough and he knew what he was working on. And he kind of like paused in his story and he said, you're not going to let me off the hook, are you?
I love that.
Exactly. And I said, that's what you pay me for.
Right.
You know,
It's,
and
and that you don't get from the AI world of
Right.
that AI can't say I'm calling BS on you
Ah,
at this very moment because I could tell you've got some inconsistencies in what you've said in past conversations and what you're saying now.
right, right. Can I share one interesting?
Yes.
It's a little bit tangential, but I work with a woman at the largest consumer company in the world, and she is partly responsible for driving insights for that company. All right, so she and I have been talking about all this AI stuff a lot. She's integrating it both at work and in her personal life. She shared a story with me where she was in Australia a couple months ago and she was having a very difficult time in a personal situation. And she was using AI and describing, and AI knew all about her because she had uploaded all of her personality profiles, etc. So when she was describing the situation, AI was coming back and saying, I totally can understand given your profile why this would be difficult, etc., etc. She told me in the space of 2 weeks 3 times her dialogue with AI brought her to tears in the way that she felt like, oh my gosh, I'm so fully seen and understood.
Wow.
But here's where it gets interesting, is that in the latter part of that 2 week period, she realized there was no growth happening.
It was just validating.
It was seeing her and validating, but she wasn't getting any tension about what her role was
Hmm.
in maintaining this dynamic. So she came back to me and I'm her coach, and she was with a whole nother level of appreciation how I would hold that tension if someone was saying, well, this is what's happening, this is what's happening, not just seeing her. I'm glad she was seen. It helped her, it touched her emotionally. It wasn't asking her, what's your role in this?
Yeah.
You might do differently. So that, again, that tension, the value of AI and the incredible value of a well-trained tension holder.
Yeah. So, what is the difference between this productive tension, like we're talking about, and maybe what's more destructive? How do you separate the two? Or people who think, let me step back and say, I think it's not uncommon in our American society that maybe this idea of tension or healthy conflict is very adverse, right? People aren't often leaning into that. And our belief, as we've said, is where that's where growth happens. So, how do we help people see where this healthy tension opportunity is and where versus something that could feel maybe more destructive and not necessarily destructive because of the executive coach side, but just something where people like they're so averse to tension they don't even want to step into it. How do you help people realize where that can go?
It's a beautiful conversation and one that takes some practice because there has to be a little bit of risk in that. I'm transforming how I'm handling your question is part of my role as chief coaching officer at SparkEffect has helped to grow and develop our coaches.
Mm-hmm.
And so in this category, the conversation is how do you know how much of that tension to bring without pushing someone over the line or being asked to walk out of the office? And that takes practice, but it does take some risk. I know I've been there a couple times myself where I've had that tension and wondered if I was putting my own job on the line.
Mm-hmm.
Every time I've done that, it's come out well. I think the answer to your question is through experience and discernment. In other words, if I'm bringing tension to our conversation, I need to be plugged into the why.
Mm-hmm.
Why am I going to say what I'm going to say? Because if I'm somewhat self-aware, I can still get into a debate situation. I can tit for tat and da 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 in my head and have challenges come from that place. Or I can be more connected to what is my job here with the person I'm coaching, bring tension. And so it's discernment,
Yeah.
making sure what I'm there to do and discerning how much, and then taking some risk. But I think it's around, we're asking the coaches to bring consistent self-awareness into the dynamic so they're not doing tension just for tension's sake, for performance, but in service to the growth of the other.
So, one of the things I know you are deeply invested in for yourself as an executive coach, as well as what you're bringing forward to the executive coaches at Spark Effect, is a level of self awareness training. I think it's really important to talk about that because part of what you're speaking of now and what we'll talk about in this next segment is really the how it goes into the trust, right? One of the things I think is beautiful about the level of coaching you do and what we provide at SparkEffect is that it's elevated. It's meant to
Mm.
bring growth, as we've talked about, but it's also about checking our own biases and how do we come forward there. And so I think it's worth us talking about that a bit because that's so powerful to the level of work we're speaking to.
So there's part of, I don't know if this is what you're speaking about in general, but what we've just been piloting and what we are going to be rolling out formally at Spark Effect is providing what's called coaching supervision to our coaches, which is, and it's not like an oversight role about
Mhm.
what work they're doing. It comes out of the therapeutic field. It's well adopted and required in most coaching organizations in the European nation. But it's really to grow that self-awareness because as people working with people, if we're working with one of these executives, we sometimes aren't aware that we're bringing in our own biases and it's end up being a filter
Mhm.
between the work that we're trying to do with the coaches. And as I said a minute ago around that discernment, we can go into kind of an argumentative, kind of a debative space, but it may not be in service. And
Mhm.
that's a great example, actually. If I have an executive I'm working with, if they're very analytical and I feel like I can meet you there, that's what happens.
Yeah.
That's what's happened. At least that's what happened for me because
Yeah.
I'm educated, etc. And if I meet someone who's type A and they come to the field of our coaching with that analytical piece, like I'm a genius, if I'm not careful, there's a part of me that wants to like, I can do that too. I'm good enough. Let's go.
Yeah.
And the work is to see when that is appropriate and when that is not.
Mhm.
If I'm responding in that way, because part of mine, I'm good enough, is to be able to play in that space. But what I've developed over the years and what I know is that what really is good enough and most effective for me is to have that counterbalance,
Mhm.
be able to meet them not at the level that they want to play always, to a certain degree, and maybe to gain confidence. But if I'm unaware, I may be in a loop, in a pattern, and I'm not really working and supporting that coach. It's just that awareness. So
Yeah.
coaching supervision is the place where we bring our coaches. They start talking. We're not like breaking down in any detail the client they're working with or the details, that's confidential. But we look at the pattern and we create a
Mhm.
space where they can get the same awareness that we just talked about, all in effort to have cleaner, more effective coaching conversations, more impact for the client, organization, and the individual, because that's who we are serving, not ourselves. And I just felt that come up for me. I
Yeah.
get some anger when I see people entering the coaching field because they like to do people work. It makes them feel good. And
Right.
you got to grow past that. That's why I said earlier in our conversation, AI, eliminate half the executive coaches. Go for it. Our coaches, what we're looking for are people who can have this self-awareness, not just meet in patterns, but really be discerning and figuring out how to do the work to serve the client.
It brought up as you were speaking, I had an example of situation I had. I was doing a CEO evaluation a few years ago for a CEO in a healthcare space. And when we were debriefing the results, it was a challenging evaluation that was done through a 360 process where the board was weighing in, the peers were weighing in, direct reports, or I shouldn't say peers, but direct reports, and some other levels in the organization. And in order and to do the debrief, the CEO already had an executive coach that was not a part of the Spark Effect organization. And so we invited that coach to join because we thought that would be very good in helping implementing what came from this evaluation. And so what was really surprising was that this coach tried to defend the results and the CEO and tried to they very much were bringing their own biases into and really not providing space for growth. What was interesting is the CEO said, I don't need you to defend me. And that was a really interesting moment. And what came up for me as you were describing the coaching supervision, this extra investment that these coaches do to try to put their own biases in check, is that isn't necessarily every coach's way of operating.
Right.
And it really can be detrimental to the growth of an executive or anybody having coaching if you don't have that level of experience to come in to say, I'm holding the space for you, and leaving some of these belief systems of our own behind. So that just popped into my head as you were
Yeah.
speaking. And I think it takes us to the other pillar that we have really strong belief in, is that the trust is so important. And so when we think about building trust, what is that? How does that show up in the C-level leaders you coach when we're trying to challenge, as you described, the egos and the experience are there, and trust is so critical?
Yeah. What I think about trust is it's the new strategic capital.
Mm,
You know,
I like that.
trust is the interstitial connections which holds everything together. And what is so difficult, I think, for a lot of, again, type A individuals, because you have to be a lot of times
Hmm.
to get to these senior positions, is to play in that space of, well, what are the behaviors that actually start to build trust?
Hmm.
And for me, one of those oftentimes is a level of vulnerability. Because when I'm working with a team and you can show where you are concerned about your own capabilities, you're not perfect, you've had some failures, it creates the space where other people can start to actually ask for help on
Mm,
things.
that's important.
What's horrible, what's most damaging in an organization is when it's like the Wizard of Oz. Don't look behind the curtain. Everybody's
Yeah.
getting in that same modality. So you have a team together and everybody is like, hey, how's it going in your section, Rod? I know you had the big project you're working on. And my only response is, I got it. I got it. And someone else will say, I've got some resources if you need it and you want to ask questions and I want to deflect because I don't want to be seen as not being fully capable.
Hmm.
And it's such a strange inverse piece that when you can start to share that you're also human, you're fallible, you don't have it all together,
Yeah.
you need resources, is when you can start to actually resource yourself and be more effective. And the ripple effect is it creates that level of trust. On another category in that, right now I'm working with another executive, and it's interesting. He's on the other side of the spectrum. He's a very even-keeled, calm. Everybody loves this person. He's relatively new into his role, about a year and a half as a CEO, but he doesn't show much emotion. I don't know if partly he doesn't have, it's not his natural place to be, right?
Yeah.
But in our conversation in the 360, people were saying the organization is too soft. And when this CEO said we need to get certain things done, the resulting experience of it was, but how does that differ from what was said 2 weeks ago or a month ago?
Mm,
In other words, what he is needing to work on is more kind of dynamic range
yeah.
in how he communicates. And to our conversation about trust, if I get upset about something, I'm not advocating we in anger, but we get frustrated. We have things where suddenly something is more urgent than another. And if our communication is always even keeled,
Hmm.
people don't know what you really need or what you really mean. And if they don't know you, they don't fully trust it.
Yeah.
The connection is when I see and feel your emotions, whether it's sadness, frustration, joy, etc., I trust you more.
Hmm.
If
That makes sense.
Yeah, so people will often think that calm, even demeanor is good, but actually it's not as trustworthy. You don't know where the person stands when they need something.
Yeah. So let me ask you something that it just prompted as well. When you talk about that example, in the work I've done, sometimes what I have come across in what you're describing is that there's this fallacy that we as leaders can fall into, that is something of the effect of, hey, I hired this person at this senior level to do this work. They should know what they need to get done and do it. Why am I having to deal with it? There's this fallacy of, since I hired you for this, I shouldn't have to lead you. And I think what comes to mind when you say that is sometimes there's missed expectation setting around what's at stake if we get this right, if we miss this mark. Where have we come from? Where are we at today? Where's the deadlines that have to happen? And if we miss them, what's going to happen? So, to what you were describing, I often see that as some components too of that range of, sometimes we think, hey, we're all in this together. And really, people still need to be led, even at the most senior levels. They need direction and motivation and inspiration and correction as well. Would you agree?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And to our connecting that back to the trust piece, okay, tying it all back. What you described partly when we say, well, I'm hiring expertise, so I shouldn't need to lead them. That sounds like I'm hiring an AI bot.
That's a great point. And that's something we fall into, isn't it, as humans,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Because we've done all the work.
Yeah.
You said you have the qualifications.
Right.
Have at it.
Yes, now
Oh,
I want you just to perform. But what we're talking about is that nobody is that way, right? We're
right.
complex systems, we're humans. And because of our need for identity and acceptance and performance, sometimes we are presenting ourselves as being a little bit more capable or having everything buttoned down
Hmm.
than it is. And so that leader leads in part by creating trust and doing that in part by showing some of their own vulnerability and when they, for instance, in that scenario, that leader might say, "You look very capable, etc. I'm not sure how I could best lead you. Where is it that I could add value?" Because now they're
Hmm.
engaging in the conversation
Yes.
and they're calling out the fact that I know you're not as perfect as you seem, so help me understand how I can lead you. And if they can use an example in their own style, maybe I come off this way and here's what I come off as versus what I mean.
Hmm.
They start to create that openness for the human to human trust. Trust is a force multiplier.
Yes. I love that. It's so powerful just to hear you say that. It absolutely is. When we think about relationship building this way and the dynamic of trust, sometimes people think, what's in it for me? What's the ROI of it? And I think we know that there's ways of measuring it through 360s and different sorts and interviews and conversations, but what's the case you make to executives you coach around why this will have a return for them?
Oh man. So that little quip, trust is a force multiplier, is great. But the other pieces like innovation, agility, resilience, all of those pieces won't stick without that human trust in it. And if you don't have trust, then you're not going to be able to challenge each other, right?
Hmm.
The lack of trust, especially vulnerability-based trust, means that don't call me on my stuff, I won't call you on yours. If we flip that around, where we have the
Hmm.
trust. And I can call you on your stuff. You can call me on my stuff. When we start to have that necessary conflict in organizations to work out, one of the biggest issues that I see in organizations is when teams say that people are not bringing everything to the table. They're not having these difficult conversations in the meetings or in their one-on-one.
Hmm.
They're having them at the water cooler, they're having them at other places, which means you get together and you say, we need to get this done. I'm sure you experience this. We have an agenda, we need to get this stuff done. 2, 3 weeks out later, people aren't getting stuff done. It's, well, what's the gap here? Everybody said we all committed to it, but if they committed to it, but they didn't have the trust where they could actually debate each other and say, I
Hmm.
don't think, then it's a false commitment.
Yeah,
And the
very
false
much so.
commitment is one of the worst things in an organization because you spend all of this energy and time aligning project plans and getting the commitment you think, and
Hmm.
then there's lack of follow through and everybody has good reasons. The result of that stems from this lack of trust, which means you can't have the right level of kind of conflict and working out the details. So the ROI of trust is just immeasurable.
It's huge. It's huge. So, as we start to wrap up our conversation, when you think about our listeners, if you were to put on your sea level hat outside of our Spark Effect world, what's your one takeaway for you defending the human coaching investment when the AI is everywhere and so easily accessible?
Oh man, yeah. I'd say that what we have to watch out for, and we touched on some of it in this conversation, is we all know the power and the importance of the brain, of the analytical piece. And with AI, it's just going to give us more access to more stuff
Hmm.
like that. And what is harder to see, because we spend our whole life going through colleges and getting experience, and we're over rotating on making sure we have the market information and this how we handle things. And this other piece that we're talking about, the power of the system synchronizations, the ability to discern and have the right level of tension, because love means tension. I mean, growth
Hmm.
requires it.
Hmm.
The idea of having this level of trust that's this force multiplier, all of those are human capabilities. So what I'm hoping and what I think is our path to salvation is that, yes, let's outsource more of the brain, but for the CHROs, the CEOs, the VPs, understand that I'm sorry, there's no shortcut.
Yeah.
It's the human to human trust, synchronization, creativity, attention that will allow us to actually create the cultures and get things done that we need to get done. So do both.
Yeah.
Invest in AI, learn how to use it, and trust yourself. That would be maybe the closing statement is it trust for the CHROs out there, your instincts are right. You got into the HR division overall as opposed to finance because you had human-centric capabilities. Don't let those get washed away with all of the AI stuff. That human element, trust your instincts. We are biological systems, and we
Hmm.
need to work together and understand those dynamics and layer on top of that this new outsourced brain that we're having called AI.
Fabulous. Rod, thank you so much for this conversation. I think we've got more coming that will, as we continue to do our work, I'm sure we'll be having more conversations together with our audience. So, for our listeners, we have free resources that are very relevant to our conversation today that you can download by visiting couragetoadvancepodcast.com, and it will take you to our Spark Effect podcast page. And again, Rod, thank you so much for this very insightful and dynamic conversation. I want to also thank our Empathy Edge podcast for hosting us, our partners there in the subseries, and to our listeners for tuning into this episode of Courage to Advance, where transformative leadership isn't about having all the answers, it's about having the courage to find them.
Love it. Love it. Well, I really enjoyed it. Thank you very much. Until you see you next time.
Thank you.